Okay, 1, 2.
Can you show me how to turn that light on?
Oh, did he turn it on before?
He's gonna fix the light. She needs a light.
Oh,
Didn't you put a new light in there?
yes, a magnetic light.
Or get a desk lamp or something? Oh, okay.
You were about to fix it?
Ooh, bright lights. Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you here. My name's Rebecca Martin, and I'm a longtime member of the Explorers Club. And I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Women's Month presentation with Bernadette McDonald on her brand new book, Alpine Rising, Sherpas, Baltis, and the Triumph of Local Climbers in the Greater Ranges. I've had the great pleasure, true pleasure, of working with Bernadette for more than 25 years, and so I'm especially delighted for her to be here this evening to present on this book. Bernadette has quite the impressive resume. She was the longtime vice president of mountain culture and the Banff Mountain Festivals at the Banff Center in the Canadian Rockies. She's authored 12 books on mountaineering, mountain culture, and the mountain environment. Among those books are Winter 8000, more recently, Art of Freedom, Freedom Climbers, Tomasz Umar, Brotherhood of the Rope, the biography of Charles Houston, and I'll Call You in Kathmandu, the Elizabeth Hawley story. She's won numerous awards, including her 2 Boardman Tasker Prizes and the Banff Award for Mountain Literature. In 2011, the American Alpine Club awarded her their highest literary honor for excellence in mountain literature. And there are so many more. But I have to mention that Bernadette has also received the Alberta Order of Excellence, which is an extremely high honor, in 2010, the Summit of Excellence Award from the Banff Center in 2007, the King Albert Award for International Leadership in the field of mountain culture and environment, and the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal. She's an honorary member of the Himalayan and Polish Mountaineering Associations and has been appointed a fellow of the Explorers Club. Bernadette is also a very serious globetrotter, as you might imagine. She's traveled extensively across the globe, including throughout Europe, including Poland, Slovenia, and Bosnia, and she's climbed there quite a bit too, as well as across Asia and Mexico. She's also served on the advisory board of National Geographic's Expeditions Council grants, which I launched and oversaw for many years. And of course, because this is Bernadette, there's more. She's also a quite talented musician, pianist, and composer. And when she's not writing, she's climbing, with great skill, hiking, skiing, paddling, and growing grapes. She and her husband, Alan, the former deputy warden of the Banff National Park, live between the town of Banff in the Canadian Rockies and their vineyard in Penticton, British Columbia. And what could be more perfect in life? What a balance, right? Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Bernadette McDonald.
Well, luckily, I have a really short talk because that was quite an introduction. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, the whole grape story is a bit sad this year because we had a big freeze in Western Canada last winter, and I don't know if this is any interest to anyone, but yeah, the entire Okanagan Valley in British Columbia has a 0 chance of having a harvest this year. It's really bad news. So, yeah, there'll be more time for hiking and climbing and camping, I think. Anyway, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's the first time that I've ever given a talk here, and it's a little bit intimidating, I have to say. When I think about this book, Alpine Rising, I sometimes wonder how on earth did I ever get started on a project this big, because it was a really big project. And I think it all goes back to when I was doing research on my last book, which was called Winter 8000. And this was a book about high altitude climbers who specialize in winter high altitude climbing. It's a niche activity. And in the course of doing the research, of course, I interviewed a lot of climbers from around the world, famous climbers like Simone Moro from Italy, Krzysztof Welicki from Poland. The Polish are particularly fond of winter, and so there were lots of Polish climbers. But I also interviewed this guy, Ali Sadpara from Pakistan. And Ali was a very important player in this high altitude winter game. He'd been on an expedition to Broad Peak and Gasherbrum 1, both times with Polish teams. He came really close to climbing Nanga Parbat in winter. And then in 2016, he actually succeeded, together with Simone Moro, the Italian, and a Basque climber named Alex Tsicon. The three of them made it to the summit of Nanga Parbat via this route, the Kinshoffer phase. Well, Nanga Parbat had seen 34 expeditions over a period of 50 years trying to do the first winter ascent, and these guys pulled it off. So this was a monumental mountaineering achievement. And the team in general got a lot of recognition. But Ali Sadpara didn't, at least not outside of his country. And at first, I don't know, I didn't think about it that much, but as I got to know the rest of the players and I saw some public events, it started to really kind of bother me why everybody else was getting all the glory on this monumental achievement. And Ali was kind of almost treated like a secondary player, like a backup person, or actually someone who was hired, and he wasn't. And yet I knew from all of the research that I'd done that he had been the powerhouse on that climb. He had been the strongest person. He'd broken most of the trail in deep snow, lower in the mountain where there was lots of snow. He'd fixed lines, most of the lines, and he'd been this incredible source of positive reinforcement for the rest of the team. But he was always in the background after it was done. And anyway, it got me thinking. So is this a pattern? Is this just Ali? Why would this happen? So I started poking around a little bit, and being a historian, I went all the way back to the early 1900s and just started reading books. I mean, I'd read most of them already anyway from other projects, but reading them again with the eye to how are the local climbers represented in these reports? Also, Alpine Club journals and this kind of thing. And I went all the way back to the early 1900s when foreign expeditions were coming to Asia to climb primarily the 14 8,000-meter peaks. And this is a very simple map, but it gives you an idea where they are. So there's Shishapangma is in Tibet. Then there are 8,000-meter peaks in Nepal and 5 in Pakistan. And these teams, these foreign teams, would come over to Asia, usually sponsored by their alpine clubs. So the French or the German or whatever alpine club, or if it was a British team, they would be sponsored by the Royal Geographical Society. And they would come through Darjeeling, India, and that's where they would hire local help. But most of the people that they hired weren't from Darjeeling. They were actually from the Khumbu region of Nepal. But at this time, of course, Nepal's borders were closed, so foreigners couldn't go in and hire people directly. But the Sherpas would travel to Darjeeling and because they knew that's where the work was. And they were particularly valuable to these foreign teams because having been born and raised at high altitude, their physiology was perfect to work at high altitude. So they were incredibly valuable people to have on these expeditions. And they did everything. They carried loads to the mountain. That was their first job. And then once they were on the mountain, they cooked, they set up camps, they broke trail through deep snow. And over time, they started going very high on these climbs. However, when I was reading the reports, which all of these teams had to write reports at the end of the expedition because, of course, their alpine clubs and so on had funded the trips. I would read the reports, and all the foreign climbers would be listed very carefully, you know, how high they climbed, what they had accomplished on the climb. But the local climbers, for the most part, were pretty anonymous. Not very often were they even named. They would just be referred to as, I don't know, 7 Sherpas or 20 porters or sometimes even coolies. So they were really in the shadows, even though they had contributed a lot to the climbs, and often they had suffered terribly on those expeditions. And there are lots and lots of examples. For example, in the 1930s, there were a number of German expeditions that were focused on Nanga Parbat, trying to get the first ascent of Nanga Parbat. And the 1934 expedition was particularly disastrous when there were 9 people who died on that expedition. 6 of the 9 were Sherpas from Darjeeling. Now these 4 survived the expedition, but you can see from the photograph that they suffered terribly. They had severe frostbite in their hands and their feet, and they all had amputations and constant lingering pain years after the expedition finished. But they all continued climbing. They kept going back a lot, back to Nanga Parbat because, of course, that was their job, and that's how they could earn money. The names of the 4 Sherpas from left to right are Dathundu, then Pasang Kikuli, then Kitar, and Pasang Picture. And Pasang Kikuli, the second one, you can see being helped down off the mountain. That was being helped down off of Nanga Parbat. He continued going back and working on expeditions as well, but his career ended just 5 years later on K2 when he volunteered to climb from base camp all the way up to Camp 7, which was at around 7,500 meters, to attempt a rescue of an American climber who was stranded there, Dudley Wolfe. He had 2 Sherpa companions with him when he went up there, Pasang Kitar Sherpa and Finsu Sherpa. And all 3 of the Sherpas and Dudley Wolfe never left that camp. They perished there. And Pasang Kikuli was only 28 years old when that happened to him, and he left behind a young widow and 2 small children. So it was clear that they were sacrificing, they were suffering, and they were sacrificing a lot for these expeditions and not getting a whole lot of credit. And that was the other thing that really struck me, was just the lack of acknowledgement. On that expedition, Fritz Wiesner was the leader, and he was a well-known climber. He had great skills, particularly on rock. And on that expedition, he actually reached 8,383 meters, climbing without bottled oxygen, an incredible accomplishment back in 1939. But many people know about Fritz Wiesner, but not many people know about his rope mate, because he wasn't soloing. This is his rope mate, Pasang Dawa Lama. Now, to be fair, when he was the rope mate of Wiesner, Wiesner was doing all the leading. But Pasang Dawa Lama was there too, and he was also climbing without bottled oxygen. And the other thing was that it wasn't his dream to climb K2. He was just doing a job, and he was doing so with second-rate equipment and equipment that didn't fit him. So yeah, not many people know about Pasang Dawa Lama. And they also, most people don't know that he made the first ascent of Choyoyu in 1954. And on that climb, he was actually leading. The team was an Austrian team, but Pasang Dawa Lama was leading them. And then 4 years later, he made the second ascent of that mountain. So he, in just a few years, he had evolved from being a high-altitude belayer to a high-altitude climber, and then a high-altitude leader. And within the Darjeeling climbing community, he was revered as a top climber. But outside of that community, almost unknown. Another example, also on K2, this was in 1953, when Dr. Charles Houston was leading an expedition. And this time, he hadn't hired Darjeeling Sherpas because it was after partition, and now the Karakoram was in Pakistan, and it was impossible for him to bring Sherpas from India into Pakistan. So he hired high altitude climbers and porters from northern Pakistan. Well, I think probably most people in this room know about the accident that happened high on K2 when Art Gilkey disappeared. And after that happened, the rest of the climbers, slowly made their way back down to base camp. And they were in pretty rough shape. I mean, they were devastated by what had happened. They were exhausted, lots of frostbite. And one man in particular, George Bell, was in such rough shape that he couldn't walk. So this man, Mohammed Hussein, who is from Sadpara village in Pakistan, hoisted George Bell onto his back and carried him for days. And George Bell wrote a lovely anecdote about what that was like, over treacherous terrain. And then 20 years later, this guy was still hauling injured people off of K2. And 30 years later, Steve Swenson from Seattle hired him to lead a group of high-altitude climbers on one of his Gasherbrum 4 expeditions, it's a long career, long, hard career, and yet I don't know anybody other than Steve Swenson who knows the name of Mohammed Hussein. He's just a completely unknown guy. I apologize for the quality of the photograph here, but it's important historically. This is Gyaltsen Norbu Sherpa, who in 1955 made the first ascent of Makalu, one of the 14 8,000ers. And then the next year, he made the first ascent of Manaslu, another 8,000er. There are only two other people in the world who can say that they've done this, Hermann Buhl and Kurt Dienberger. Both of those guys are famous, world-famous mountaineers. Gyaltsen Norbu Sherpa, not so much. Jump ahead. In 1985, French climber Jean-Marc Boivin flew off the summit of Gasherbrum II with his hang glider, and he became quite famous for doing that. But not many people know that this little guy, named Little Karim, not only climbed Gasherbrum II with him, but carried the hang glider up there so that he could fly off the top. Again, another example of not much recognition. Well, there are countless examples, but one of the ones that I particularly was taken with goes back to the first ascent of K2 in 1954. There was a team on the mountain from Italy. It was led by Ardito Desio. He had 11 Italian climbers, and he had hired 13, I think it was 13 Hunza porters and a whole battalion of porters, Balti porters, to carry 13 tons of gear and food and so on to base camp of K2. And again, because this was after partition, all the high altitude workers were from Pakistan. Well, at some point, the two summit climbers needed some extra oxygen to be carried up to where they were bivouacked and camped just below the summit, not too far below the summit, around 8,100 meters. And the leader, Desio, decided that the youngest member of the team, who was Walter Bonatti, who became very famous, of course, later, that Walter Bonatti should carry the oxygen up to these two summit climbers. Well, he couldn't carry it all by himself, so he needed to find a helper, and the person that he found was this man, Amir Mehdi. Mehdi was working on the mountain. He's from the Shimshal Valley in Pakistan, and he wasn't too keen on the idea at the start, but Walter Bonatti kind of tricked him a little bit. He made some vague pseudo promises that maybe there'd be an opportunity to go to the summit, and so so he agreed. So off they went with the extra oxygen for the two summit climbers, and they got up to the spot where they were supposed to be camped, and they couldn't find them. So they looked and they yelled and, where are you? And finally, just before, just at dusk, they heard a call down from one of the summit climbers saying, "Leave the oxygen and descend." Well, it was too late to do that. So I'll just read a little bit from the book about what happened next. Mehdi was frantic by that point, pacing, kicking at the slope, and howling in pain. His toes were crammed inside Italian army boots, 2 sizes too small. They were beginning to freeze. Bonatti felt it was too risky to attempt a night descent, so he stomped out a platform on which to bivouac until morning. The night sky dazzled with 1,000,000 stars so bright the two men could see their reflections in the snow. As the paralyzing cold encircled them, they shivered, clinging together, sharing their warmth on the highest open bivouac in history at that time. But the starlight faded when the first gusts of a blizzard moved in. Driving snow plastered the climbers' clothing and coated their faces. The desperate night dragged on. At times, neither Bonatti nor Mehdi were sure if they were alive or dead. Finally, shortly before dawn, Mehdi howled one last scream and stumbled off the platform, intent on reaching the tent more than 350 meters below. As Bonatti watched him reeling down the slope in the half-light, appearing confused, clumsy, and out of control, he doubted that Mehdi would make it down alive. He was wrong. Mehdi, his feet numb with frostbite and his face contorted in pain, eventually lurched into the camp where Isakan, another Hunza high-altitude porter, tended him. Bonatti arrived hours later. At 6 p.m. on that same day, July the 31st, 1954, Campagnoni and Laciadelli summited, making the first ascent of K2. But their victory had come at a terrible price. Mehdi was transported to a hospital in the city of Skardu and then to a military hospital in Rawalpindi, where doctors amputated all of his toes and a third of one foot. 8 months later, he returned to his home in Shimshal. He had lost the ability to climb and could no longer support his family. Well, this is an example of where the two summit climbers became household names in Italy. And Walter Bernardi became one of the leading alpinists of all time. And Mehdi, who had helped make it happen, spent the remaining 45 years of his life living in pain and obscurity. Well, almost 60 years later, there was another really important ascent of K2, the first winter ascent. And I can't think of a better example of how things have changed for local climbers between that 1954 expedition and the one in 2020-21. Just like on Nanga Parbat, there had been teams trying for years, 34 years actually, with K2, trying to get up this mountain in winter. It was the last of the 8,000ers to be climbed in winter, and it was a toughie. In the winter of 2020-21, there were actually 60 climbers, that's 60 climbers, trying to climb it in winter. And if you can just imagine what that would be like at the base camp of winter, of K2 in winter, 60 climbers. It was crawling with climbers from all over the world. Some of them were wealthy, some of them were experienced, some not so experienced, and of course lots of workers, lots of people working on the mountain. Well, among them were 10 Nepali climbers, and 3 were from the Rolwalling Valley, led by this man, Mingma Ji. His sole reason for being there was to claim a first winter ascent on an 8,000er. It's something that Nepal did not have in its record, which it seems amazing in a way since they're such great high altitude climbers, but they just didn't have that. That's what he wanted. There were also 5 professional Sherpa climbers who were there to support this man, Nirmal Purja, known as Nims Dai or Nims, and the 10th climber was Sona Sherpa. And this was the team of 10. I think you can feel the power and the experience in that group. The funny thing is that they actually didn't intend to be a team. At the beginning of the trip, I think Mingma Ji and Nims were actually kind of in competition with each other, personally. I mean, they both wanted the winter ascent for Nepal, but they also wanted it for themselves. But what happened was that Mingma Ji and his 2 partners were fixing lines high on the mountain above 7,000 meters, and they actually ran out of rope. And so now they had a problem on their hands. But it turned into an opportunity because he got in touch with Nims. Nims had lots of rope, and they decided to work together. And by the end of December 2020, the 2 teams were working together, plus Sona, the 10th. And I'm going to just read again a little bit from the book about what happened above from Camp 3 and up. Camp 3 began stirring at midnight. After the usual ordeal of lighting the stoves, boiling water, double and triple checking the contents of their packs, and then stuffing their feet into their high-altitude boots, they emerged from the tents one by one. Nimsdai, Kili, Dawa Tenjin, Sona, Dawa Temba, and Mingma Tenzi left first. Mingma Ji came to the sad realization that his previous day's efforts had so exhausted him that he didn't feel strong enough to climb without oxygen. Disappointed, he fiddled with his oxygen regulator, which didn't fit properly. He eventually found a spare regulator, but chilled his fingers dangerously in the process of attaching it. By the time he was finally ready to start up, the others were already nearing Camp 4. It didn't look like a promising summit day for Mingma G. He left Camp 3 with Mingma David, Pem Shiri, and Gelji. They reached Camp 4 2 hours later and were shocked at the chilling effects of the wind. When Mingma G stopped for a few moments on the upper side of a crevasse while waiting for Mingma David, he became so cold he considered turning around. He said, "I almost gave up there because I was worried to lose my toes." He checked his watch. It was 5 a.m. In another hour, the sun would appear above the horizon, so he decided to continue, at least until dawn. At the same moment that he felt the first warming rays of the sun, the wind miraculously dropped. The 4 climbers stopped to soak up the rays and warm themselves before climbing up to the bottleneck. The heat from the sun had given them extra energy and hope. The first group was fixing lines up the bottleneck, Mingma Tenzi leading the way. Mingma G's group climbed toward them, finally catching up before the traverse. Nims urged them all, saying, "We all had that common pride, a common goal. This was for Nepal." When they reached the small plateau 200 meters below the summit, they stopped to brew some tea. After resting a bit, Mingma Tenzi resumed fixing. They were still 4 hours from the summit. They planned to stop around 10 meters from the top and continue as a group to the highest point. "We all started moving together and our 360 GoPro was on," Mingma G said. "We then started moving towards the summit, singing the national anthem. This was my 3rd time summiting on K2, but this time it was connected with the pride of the nation. It was a thrilling moment. I had tears in my eyes and my body was shaking itself, bearing goosebumps. No member in the team can explain the moment we had there." The 10 Nepali climbers stepped onto the summit at 4:43 p.m., January 16th, 2021. First winter ascent of K2. The video of their final steps to the summit sped around the world, delighting millions. What a sight. Their faces lit up by the low-angled sun, the distinct curvature of the earth as their backdrop, their crimson and gold suits as bright as jewels, and that magnificent indigo sky. Well, this jubilant team descended to base camp over the next couple of days, and then to Skardu and Kathmandu. There's for an endless parade of celebrations, and I think really the whole world celebrated with them, except for a few climbers who actually wanted the first winter ascent of K2, and there were a few of those, quite a few in Poland actually. But in the 60 years that separated those two K2 expeditions, there were a lot of incremental steps that created a different reality for these local climbers. First of all, their climbing skills had improved immensely, and as their climbing skills improved, so their expectations rose. For example, in 1975, when Pertemba Sherpa was asked to work with Sir Chris Bonington, the British climber, on his 1975 southwest face of Everest attempt, Pertemba agreed, but on one condition, that he have a chance at the summit. And Chris agreed, and he did get the summit. Another change had to do with education and communication skills. As long as climbers from Pakistan and Nepal were uneducated, and in many cases actually illiterate, it was impossible for them to communicate their needs to their employers, or communicate to potential sponsors of their personal aspirations. Now this guy, Babu Shiri Sherpa, was one of the early great communicators. He was he was just an instantly likable guy. He spoke 4 languages, and he understood the power of the media. So, and that helped him to attract sponsors like Mountain Hardware, as you can see the logo. He actually went to California and convinced them to build him a tent, a super lightweight tent, so that he could spend the night on the summit of Everest. Well, it was a bit of a stunt, but it certainly garnered him a lot of attention. And he did a lot of other speed ascents, repeat ascents, and was actually a Nepalese national hero at the time of his, well, unfortunately, very early death at the age of 35. Another communication change took place that I think would be more accurately described as a revolution for local climbers, and that was when they started using social media for themselves, telling their own stories on social media. They no longer had to try and raise money for a film or find a book publisher or something like this. They just had to go on social media. And they're all doing it. For example, Imtiaz Sadpara, not a famous climber, although he's a very experienced high altitude climber. Even Imtiaz has thousands of followers. This guy, of course, I'm sure you all know him. He has, anybody want to guess how many followers? 547,000. Still a lot. And, you know, a lot of them are using social media, obviously, to elevate their profile. And in some cases, monetizing that profile. And for some of them, it's more about staying connected with the mountain community. Another logical step that has taken place has to do with the business of guiding foreigners on their mountains. And this too has happened, particularly in Nepal. Now, I think if you first take a look at this image, you think, oh yeah, right, that's Everest. I mean, everybody knows it's crowded on Everest. But this is Annapurna. As more and more people are coming to Asia to try and climb all 14 of the 8,000 meter peaks, sometimes 3 and 4 in a season, all of these peaks are getting crowded, and this is what it's starting to look like. This picture is from Annapurna in 2021, when 68 people summited just 2 weeks after arriving in base camp. So the whole model is changing. So lots of changes, lots of incremental changes leading up to that incredible moment on the top of K2, the first winter ascent. But high altitude climbing remains extremely dangerous, particularly for the people who are working up there. And it's important to note that those 10 Nepali climbers were not working for anyone. They were there as individuals climbing for themselves. But there were lots of people working there. And one of them was our friend from the beginning of the show, Ali Sadpara, and his son, Sajid. And they had a client, John Snorri, from Iceland. So the Nepali climbers had gone back to, their celebrations, and there were still lots of people left at K2 Base Camp waiting for another good weather window. And when one opened up in early February, a number of them started up the mountain, including the Snorri trio. Well, by February 4th, there were a lot of climbers in Camp 3. Actually, there were too many climbers in Camp 3 because there was confusion about the number of tents. So there were like 6 people crammed into tents that were designed for 3. They couldn't melt snow, they couldn't make tea, they couldn't cook, and they couldn't rest properly. And this was the night before a summit attempt. Well, a lot of the climbers went down that night. They realized that they couldn't do it. This is Ali in his tent that night. And now you've seen a few pictures of him, so you know he doesn't usually look like this. But the pressure and the hideous situation that they were in, it's hard to even imagine. Anyway, they did go up. Ali, his son, and the client, plus one more independent climber, a Chilean alpinist named J.P. Moore. It didn't go well. In particular, Sajid, the son, started having problems at the bottleneck, so, around 8,000 meters. And his father, even though the two of them had both climbed K2 before in the summer, his father convinced him, look, this is not your day. You go back down to Camp 3 and we'll climb it, we'll come back, and then we'll all descend the mountain together. So he did. He went back to Camp 3. He got there around 5 p.m. that night, and he, put a lamp, like a light on, so it would be easy for the summit climbers to find the tent, because of course it would be night, and made tea, lots of tea. He waited all night, and of course they didn't show up. In the meantime, he was in touch with base camp, and they kept encouraging him to descend to base camp because there was a storm moving in, and he was by himself. It was pretty obvious at this point that the summit climbers weren't coming. So he did. He descended, and a couple of days later, some Army helicopters did some passes around the mountain looking for any sign of life. Of course, there was nothing. And eventually, Sajid, the son, was flown to the nearest city, Skardu, and had to attend a press conference because all the press wanted to know what was going on. His father was a very famous climber in Pakistan, and they wanted to know. He attended the press conference. He answered the questions as best he could, and then he went home to his family, his grieving family. This is a photo from earlier times, and I think it's just, it's a beautiful photo of father and son, father teaching son about what to drink. Anyway, they had a lovely relationship. And later that year, Sajid decided to go back to K2 to look for the bodies. And I'm just going to read his words. I had one of the most challenging and traumatic experiences in life. I don't want to remember the time of despair and fear. I am healing myself, and I try to heal the whole family as well. I am recovering my strength and my rationality with the passage of time. And I decided to lead the search and recovery of my father, Ali Sadpara, John Snorri, and J.P. Moore. My family and I will leave no stone unturned to recover them and give them the right rituals as per everyone's faith. I don't know what happened to them. That is why I am here now. It has been 4.5 months. Of course, I know he's not alive. I was grateful to those who used technologies I wouldn't begin to understand to look for them from afar. And now it is my turn to go back and see for myself. My father is with Allah now. He's safe. I go only to find answers and to retrace those last steps, to see what he might have seen, to see if he left any signs for me to follow, if there's anything he wants me to know. Well, it's a pretty sad ending to what started out as such a triumphant season on K2 for local climbers. But it's also a realistic ending because although, for the most part, foreign climbers go to the high mountains of Asia for personal reasons, for the most part, local climbers spend time on those mountains to earn money. It's the fastest way and the best way, really, but it's the most dangerous way for them to earn enough money to support their families and educate their kids. And it's these climbers from Pakistan and Nepal, whether they're famous or unknown, whether they're experienced or if they're still learning on the job, whether they hold some kind of speed record or if they're really just starting out, these are the climbers who are writing the next chapter of climbing in the Himalaya and the Karakoram. And for some of them, it is bringing them fame and even fortune. And others have been trained to the highest level of mountaineering competence to be international guides, the UIAGM guide certification, 70 at the moment in Nepal. but many, many more are still climbing with second-rate equipment, no training, marginal salaries, and maybe most seriously, no insurance, either for injury or for death. This is Mingma Ji again. He is a UIAGM guide, internationally qualified guide. He has his own guiding company in Nepal, very respected. And he is one of the most respected climbers in the entire country. He is guardedly optimistic, I would say, about the future for Nepali climbers. He says, "I think we should do what we can to make our community proud, to test human limits and to make oneself better and better. Sherpas and mountains are synonymous to each other. Our future generation will be far better than us. I'm not ready to quit alpinism until I feel that I've helped change mountaineering in Nepal." Dawa Yangzam Sherpa is also an internationally qualified guide, and at the moment the only female UIAGM guide from Nepal. And she's actually doing that. She is helping change mountaineering in Nepal in her own way. She's teaching young women. She's not only teaching them about climbing techniques and skills and taking them on expeditions, not really guiding them as much as mentoring them, but she's also teaching them about leadership. Vinayak Mala is also a UIAGM guide working on the high mountains in Nepal, but he's doing something else which is really interesting. He's starting to develop rock climbing areas, like cragging areas, and ice climbing venues for people who want to go to Nepal and climb, but they're not necessarily wanting to go to an 8,000 meter peak. And he just thinks that there's more to more to the world, or more to the world of climbing than 8,000 meters. And I think he's onto something. Sirbaz Khan, the young guy on the left, is probably Pakistan's leading high altitude climber at the moment. And this photo shows him with his mentor, Ali Raza Sadpara. What a face. Anyway, Sirbaz takes his position very seriously within the Pakistani climbing community. Quoting him, he says, "I am fully committed to winning honor and pride for my country, my people, and especially the underprivileged mountaineering community of Pakistan. The coming period is ours. We will try our best to leave a better field for the coming generation. I will work for them, whether it is insurance, training, or any other way. Our climbing community can go a long way if we work together." And Sajid, son of Ali, and also a rising star in Himalayan climbing, is both hopeful and eternally optimistic. He says, "We are the new generation, and we are ready for new challenges and our rightful place in climbing history." Well, that's what this book is about. Climbers from Pakistan and Nepal. Climbers, in some cases, with names few have heard. Climbers from remote villages. Climbers who were trusted partners. Climbers whose expectations rose with their skills. And ultimately, it's about climbers who are transforming the history of mountaineering in the high mountains of Asia in many ways, through their abilities to teach and to mentor, to create successful businesses, in some cases to realize their personal dreams, like these three girls, sisters, climbed Everest together, and for still too many to make the ultimate sacrifice for their clients, like this young man, Tenjin Lama Sherpa, who died last year while guiding on Shishapangma. More than anything, this book is about respect. Respect for the men and the women who work in the highest mountains on earth and who are now emerging from out of the shadows and into the light that they so deserve. Thank you. Would you like the mic? Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Bernadette, for writing this important book and for bringing to light all the accomplishments of these amazing local people.
I have to get up?
Yes, I know. It's hard for little people. Yes.
I'm safe.
So, really powerful talk and such a compelling read. I mean, really gripping, and you just realize the immense sacrifice that these people have made through over the course of the last century. When did this idea trigger in your mind to write this book, and do you have an intended impact for this book? I mean, obviously, you're synthesizing a lot of information about local climbers in the Himalaya to bring the larger group to light for the public.
Yeah, I think if I people do ask me, what is the intention of this book other than just that? I mean, it is a historical document, hopefully, but I think the whole training aspect is so important, and it's really quite well developed in Nepal. There's been a lot of impact from the Khumbu Climbing Center, for example, in Nepal. It's made a huge difference to the skill levels of a lot of the people who are working in the mountains, and it's really important that they have this, because it's not just a matter of climbing. I mean, they are strong. I mean, everybody knows that they're strong, but there are so many skills that you need to guide, and it's not just about getting up the mountain with your client, but it's also getting them back down again. And, especially in the case of an accident or if a storm moves in, there are a lot of things that you need to know. And about, snow safety, all that kind of stuff is being taught in Nepal, and it's making a huge difference for those people. The situation is quite different in Pakistan, and I think that if anything, one good thing that might come out of this book would be that there'd be more interest in some of the training facilities that are starting to function in Pakistan. I mean, just in the last year, I know of 3 training facilities that are starting up. And obviously, they're not at the same level as the Khumbu Climbing Center, not even close. I mean, it's kind of scary, actually, some of the stuff that's going on. But it's, it has to start, and there has to be foreign investment, and there is in all 3 cases, because that's how the Khumbu Climbing Center started. It was with a lot of foreign investment. Anyway, that would be one thing that would be good.
Yeah, let's see if I'm sure we have a few questions from the audience. If you can get a microphone. There's somebody in the middle there. Yes.
Oh, a microphone. Oh, dear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation and attention that's long overdue. What about the responsibility of climbers to be sure they recognize the contribution of these people? I know there are trip reports that exclude them. There's, updates from Everest about team members, and they're just never mentioned. So we have a responsibility as well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because, this, I suppose, is fairly typical. If you have an expedition or even a trip of any kind and there are 5 people involved, you'll have 5 different histories, right? But if you read the trip reports, let's say from an Annapurna expedition written by one of the clients, and then if you read the same, if you read a report from that same expedition written by the owner of the expedition company, all of the climbers are listed, including all of the workers, and that's really nice to see. But yes, of course, we do have a responsibility. And the other thing, I think that as climbers and even trekkers, we have a responsibility, and that is to really do our research if we're going to hire a company, because they're not all the same. They're not all created equal. And some of them treat their workers really well, and they do provide insurance and training and all that kind of stuff, and others don't. And you have to read beyond the websites in order to see what their track record is. And I think that's a really important thing too.
Thank you. More questions from the audience? Yes.
You mentioned John Snorri, the Icelandic climber. The last I heard is he attempted to make another attempt on K2, but failed, and his body is still up there, from what I understand. And expeditions have been going right by without doing anything about it. Have you heard anything more recent about Snorri and grenades?
Yeah. So when Saji went back up, they did find all three of the bodies, and they moved them.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they didn't bring them down. They hadn't. They thought maybe they could bring them down, but they were too high. So they moved all three of the bodies.
Because there are reports that the Sherpas are taking a much more commercial attitude towards what they're doing than they did in the old days, when they were pretty much described as hero, and basically heroic impression. Do you have any feeling that the attitude of the Sherpas towards their client has changed?
Well, I think the big change is that they're in charge. They are totally in charge. Once the client is on the mountain, from everything I've heard from clients and people who are working on the mountains, everybody obeys the Sherpas. I don't know if that's what you're asking or not, but.
All right, thank you.
Well, what about Everest? I heard it's just a mess.
Just 1 second here to get the microphone. Oh, somebody behind you. Okay.
You can ask your question. I think it was related.
I mean, with Everest, it's such a mess. I mean, there's so many. Who's like profiting over Everest? Because it's like it's a calamity of people waiting to go up and people paying off the Sherpas and who's profiting? It's a big calamity.
Mess? Well,
a mess.
it's complicated. There are lots of people who are profiting from Everest.
Thanks.
High altitude climbing is a big business. That's pretty clear. Yeah, especially Everest, but more so now a lot of the other 8,000ers too. But yeah, obviously the government is profiting greatly because some of the fees go to them. The companies, and there are some huge and powerful companies in Nepal that are profiting greatly. The lead guides are doing well. They're making good money, and they're moving to Kathmandu and educating their kids so that they don't have to guide in the mountains. There's lots of people making money. Yeah.
Just a question right behind this gentleman. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, how has your book and your research been received, both on the one hand, from the local climbers when you were especially interviewing them and reaching out to them? Were they open to talking and sharing their stories, or were they skeptical about, again, having an outsider sort of tell their story? Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, by not local, foreign climbers, when you're shining the light on this, are they receptive about it? Do they realize the importance, or has there been pushback in that?
Yeah, well, that's a 3-part question, isn't it? Honestly, I don't think I felt pushback from foreign climbers. I think at some level, foreign climbers realize that there's been an inequity over the years. I was I was lucky and unlucky because I wrote this book during COVID. I couldn't travel. I couldn't actually do the interviews in Pakistan and Nepal. So a lot of stuff was done, Zooming and all kinds of other ways. But the best thing that happened was that I had a partner in Pakistan and a partner in Nepal, and we worked together for months, actually. Saklan in Pakistan traveled to all the villages. He speaks all the languages. He's from Sadpara village. He knows the climbers. So he could do those interviews on my behalf. I mean, we obviously worked on them ahead of time. And the same in Nepal. There was a young woman who works with the Himalayan database, and she speaks, Nepali and Sherpa, and she's a Rai. So she's not Sherpa, she's Rai, but there are a number of Rai people who are now getting involved in the guiding business. So she was able to connect me in a way to people that I wouldn't have been able to get to, including some pretty personal stories. So, long answer, but... So how do they feel? I don't know how they're going to feel because not many of them have read it yet, but the process was pretty good, actually.
It's right here, front row.
You made a really good comment about local tracking companies as well, not just for climbers, but anyone who wants to go there. And I saw this myself that some of the guides and the porters don't always get paid, frankly, right? They have to wait for their money, etc. What's your recommendation for anyone who wants to go there to do research and sort of hire the right company or guide?
Yeah, I hear you, and that's why you can't just go by and make your decisions based on the website of the companies, because of course they're all perfect, right? In terms of climbing, I think one of the best ways is to take a look at what's happened in the previous 3 or 4 years in terms of accidents and just see how it was handled. Because again, I mean, accidents do happen, but the way they're handled shows a lot about how an organization treats their staff. That works really well with the climbing companies. For trekking, I think it's actually harder to make your decision. I mean, I guess talk to people who have used different companies and make sure that your research, even when it's on the internet, isn't just about the websites. It goes way beyond that, because yeah, it's not consistent. It's definitely not consistent in either country.
Back there. Yep.
Thank you for speaking to us today. Towards the end of your presentation, you brought up a photo of a local woman climber and talked about how she'd been training and mentoring other young local women. Have you seen an increase in the number of local women hired to be part of expedition teams for these high altitude climbs?
Yes, but it's a very, very slow process. Dawa Yangzum is, what is she now? 30-something?
I
Early?
think she's 42.
Dawa?
Yeah, I think she is. I just was reading
Wow.
her bio.
I
Yeah.
just saw her last week. She looks like 20.
Oh, well, maybe.
Yeah, anyway,
Maybe not, but-
she's holding her.
and
her-
she's a North Face athlete.
Yes,
too.
she's a North Face athlete.
Mhm.
And a Rolex sponsored climber. Yeah, she's doing okay. Yes, so there are a few, and it's people like Dawa who are actually bringing that process along. The situation in Pakistan is completely different. There are a few female climbers, but none of them are working professionally. None that I know of are working professionally. So that's 10 to 20 years behind in that process. It's still pretty male dominated though, even in Nepal. Sorry.
Is it right here? Yep.
You talked a little bit about people not having adequate clothes for climbing. And I'm wondering, I mean, you're talking about sponsorship, but like, does everyone now have the correct clothes, like of the Sherpas?
I would say Sherpa climbers do. They have good clothing, they have good equipment, and in fact, a number of them are involved in the business of manufacturing it. So they have their system is pretty much dialed. It's not the same in Pakistan. Again, it depends on the company. Some companies are providing good equipment, and some are not. And so then what they're doing is they're picking up their equipment at used stores, and it's older and it's worn out, and the accidents happen because of that. I mean, frostbite in particular.
I know, I recall some expeditions actually bringing the gear for the local climbers in Pakistan because they knew they had nothing. You know, they didn't have the proper shoes to walk across glaciers and so on.
Yeah,
Sometimes.
and there have been efforts like that. The problem is this stuff is used in really difficult situations, and it doesn't really last forever. And so, you know, after a year or two of guiding, they need new equipment. It's the harshest conditions, you know, to use this stuff. So it wears out.
Any other questions? Yes.
What happened to the father who got stranded on a mountain with 4 other people?
Ali Sadpara?
And then his son was going to go find him?
Yeah, so he found the 3 bodies, but they basically all he could do was relocate them to less traveled parts of the mountain. But yeah, they all died. But you're wondering what actually happened?
And what happened to the son? Is he still gone?
Yeah, he's very active. He asked his mother, because he's the eldest now in the family, so he's responsible for, you know, financially for the family. And he asked his mother if he could continue climbing, and she said, "Yes, son, but not in winter." So he is, so far anyway, he's just climbing in summer. But yeah, he's very busy. Yeah, he's a rising star. Yeah, he's a nice guy actually.
Another question about Everest. Are they going to try to control it more, or is it just a money maker? So Nepal uses that as their cash cow. I mean, that's
Well,
their cash
it is
cow.
a cash cow. But there's a funny thing that's happening this year. I don't know maybe if some of you have read about these new regulations about Everest. They're trying to limit the use of helicopters in the area because it's you know it's busy. It's very busy, and a lot of the helicopter use wasn't really required. It was for bringing in fresh fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. So they're trying to limit that. But the other thing that I thought was really funny was they're after the outfitters to limit the size of the individual tents for the top level clients because they were getting so large that a
It's
base
all
camp,
corporate.
they
It's
were
all
running out of
corporate.
space at base camp.
And it's all corporate endorsement and all.
So they need,
North Face, and they want their name on it, and it's all about profit. It's all about money,
yeah, there's lots of money.
and it's an economic, environmental mess. The whole Everest is like a complete catastrophe.
Well, there are a lot of rules now about waste and that kind of thing. But it's been a long time in coming.
Long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, question right behind you, if you can pass the mic.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if within your research you have looked into the effects that these climbs have on the environment, and if there are there any effects, and if so, are they really bad or not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, just that much traffic on the mountains, particularly at the base camps, has an effect. But I don't think it holds a candle to the effect of climate change overall. Definitely, everything I've heard from the older people who've been involved in guiding and climbing in those regions, they see a lot of change, and in some cases, it's actually making the climbs a lot harder. Just more danger, I guess, from Serac Fall and that kind of thing.
Okay, we'll take one or two more questions, and then we'll.
Bernadette,
Yeah.
can I change the subject a little bit? I began climbing back in the 1960s, and one of my favorite destinations was Banff and the area around Banff. Could you tell us a little bit about how the Banff area survived the onslaught of climbers over the years, and is it still as an attractive and a wonderful place as it always was, from your perspective?
Well, don't get me started. No casinos, but no, it's yeah. Phil used to come up to Banff every year for the festival, and I don't remember, when was the last year you were there?
Oh gosh, it must have been about 15, 20
Yeah. Well, it has actually changed a lot. I think one of the big changes was when Parks Canada decided to, and I don't remember why, one year they decided to give a free park pass to every Canadian.
That's a good idea.
I know, except it is actually. But the problem is that now all those people know how great the parks are. And so, no, I know, I'm kind of joking, but no, the visitation to the parks has gone sky high, and it's in the summer it's actually a problem, and there are all kinds of studies and different organizations are trying to figure out how to handle it. But there are weekends where the entire town of Banff is like a slow-moving parking lot. Nobody can find a place to park, and everybody's just driving around looking for a place to park, and it's gridlock. And so where we live is on the other side of the bridge. And so we have to get out of town early in the morning if we want to do something, and then stay away as long as possible so we can avoid the crowds to get back home again. It's pretty crowded.
Still very pretty, though.
It's very pretty.
And I think there's one more question, or?
I couldn't follow that.
Okay. So thank you, everybody, so much for coming out this evening to hear Bernadette. Thank you, Bernadette, for being here and for writing this incredibly important book about these exceptional climbers who have received little attention. And
thanks for having me, guys.
And if you haven't bought a book, it's amazing, and you'll get a good price here this evening. So come on over to the table. Bernadette's coming out there right now as we sell and sign more books. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm coming right now. Okay, I've got this, that.